Welcome back, folks, to another edition of the New Yorker Political Scene. This week we'll be discussing a very serious topic, a very somber topic, the conviction of Hunter Biden on felony gun charges. I think this is a very interesting episode of the New Yorker Political Scene, in part because Hunter Biden is such an interesting person who's led such a textured life. I don't think any other presidential offspring has lived on the edge in the way that Hunter Biden has. The details about his addiction and sexual escapades, and just the fact that he, shacked up with his deceased brother's wife and taught her how to smoke crack and took a bunch of crazy pictures of himself naked and half naked with sex workers and with crack pipes. I mean, it's just, the details are pretty incredible. So on the one hand, it's just a really fascinating story of, this guy living basically the life of a rock star while his dad is the vice president. Super interesting. But also, I think it's a revealing episode in terms of the New Yorker Political Scene as a podcast. And there's some interesting revelations from the hosts of the Political Scene about their personal connections to Hunter Biden, as well as just their political persuasions. So let's get into it.
Evan, you're our Bidenologist. I wanted to start with you. What was this case against Hunter Biden about, and what struck you?
Yeah, I think it's worth paying a moment of attention to it because I think for a lot of Americans, people have just kind of tuned it out. They just sort of say, the Hunter Biden thing, I don't really want to pay attention to it.
Come on, Evan.
But it's actually pretty revealing about the Biden family and about the presidency and, of course, about our politics.
Of course it's revealing about our politics, and it's interesting stuff. It's salacious. Whether you care to admit it or not, Hunter Biden was cashing in on his father's name. The reason why he was being investigated in the first place and why any of these charges were filed is because there was a special prosecutor looking into Hunter Biden, in large part because of all of the things that Republicans have been obsessed with for years. If you turn on Fox News or you read the Wall Street Journal or you go on your uncle's Facebook page, I'm sure you know people who have been obsessed with Hunter Biden and want nothing more than talk about Hunter Biden. So I think Evan is speaking specifically to liberals, probably the people who read The New Yorker, but it is a little bit crazy to suggest that Americans aren't somehow interested in Hunter Biden. This case in particular had to do with gun charges. Hunter Biden bought a gun and he filled out a form where he said he wasn't addicted to drugs. And then in the trial, they basically proved pretty clear as day that he was, in fact, addicted to drugs. So that was before Joe Biden was president, but he was vice president for part of that time. And one thing I think is interesting that we'll get into is Joe Biden knew that all of this would be hashed out in public, and that his son was recovering from a really serious addiction. And if any of you know someone who struggled with addiction, you know how delicate it can be, how delicate someone's sobriety can be once they're in recovery. And Hunter Biden supposedly was sober for about a year before Joe Biden launched his campaign for the presidency. Now, just imagine knowing that your son has a year or so of sobriety. We're not talking about like an entry-level addiction here. We're talking about crack. We're talking about a guy who went out and bought a gun and whose girlfriend at the time was concerned about what he might do with that gun. And Joe Biden, his father, who'd already been vice president and a senator, decided that he, in his late 70s, needed to be the president of the United States, and that all of this stuff was going to be hashed out in the public sphere, potentially compromising his last surviving son's sobriety. I do think that that is a decision worth scrutinizing.
President Biden himself flew by helicopter up to Wilmington, was photographed on the tarmac embracing his son. And yet it's also this, we have to say, right, it's this kind of sordid, awful, awkward portrait, not only of Hunter's addiction that emerged, but also just after the tragic death of Biden's only other son, Beau Biden, really just what happened to the family. It sort of spiraled apart. And it's, it's the stuff of grotesque kind of tabloidery, right? You had Hunter then taking up with Beau's widow.
And Hunter had been married, right?
That's right. And there were, family members testifying for the prosecution and for the defense in this trial. It's this spectacle that unfortunately, right, has been the perceived political vulnerability for Joe Biden, that the way to get to this man, Republicans have identified, Donald Trump has identified for many years, was to go through the weak spot of his, well-known love and devotion to his family, but also this very, very troubled member of it.
Of course, Donald Trump and Republicans were going to use the Hunter Biden stuff to try to hurt Joe Biden. That's how every political campaign in the history of this country has been run. Just to refresh your memory, these are all of the people who ran for the Democratic nomination in 2020. Bernie Sanders, Tulsi Gabbard, Elizabeth Warren, Michael Bloomberg, Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, Tom Steyer, Deval Patrick, Michael Bennett, Andrew Yang, John Delaney, Cory Booker, Marianne Williamson, Julian Castro, Kamala Harris, Steve Bullock, John Sestak, Wayne Messam, Beto O'Rourke, Tim Ryan, Bill de Blasio, Kirsten Gillibrand, Seth Moulton, Jay Inslee, John Hickenlooper, Mike Gravel, Eric Swalwell, and Richard Ojeda. And despite that, despite the fact that there are so many people representing any number of political positions across the Democratic Party spectrum, Joe Biden and the Democratic Party establishment insisted that he must become president.
There were images of Hunter Biden shirtless, holding crack pipes. There were, all kinds of salacious details. But the picture of Biden himself was kind of absent, painting a picture of where was he during this period when his son was spiraling into this incredible addiction and buying a gun and taking up with the widow of his deceased son. Where was Biden during this period?
That was one of the most interesting things about this, I think. I mean, as somebody who's interested in the lives of the presidents and obviously of this president, we suddenly became aware of this period and got real texture on a couple of interesting things. I mean, one is actually there are these artifacts of that time that are quite revealing. I mean, there was a voicemail message that was released initially kind of with malicious intent, frankly, by Fox News and so on. But anybody else who listens to it who's not looking at it for a political valence, just you hear the reality of what was going on in that family. It's Joe Biden leaving a voicemail message for his son Hunter where he says,
"I gotta get some help. I don't know what to do. I know you don't either, but I'm here no matter what you need."
There's a Politico columnist, Jonathan Martin, who I mostly dislike, who tweeted, "In the Sorkin version of 2024, Hunter's conviction would be the escape hatch Biden takes to focus on family and drop out of the race, deferring to a Democrat who's not approaching 82. It is funny to me that someone like Jonathan Martin sort of fantasizes about the Aaron Sorkin version of reality. But I do think there is something to his point that in a parallel universe, Joe Biden would simply step aside and let someone else take on Donald Trump, because if the Democrats really are insisting that democracy is on the line, it would seem like the responsible thing to do is not simply allow an 82-year-old man with all of these liabilities to be the party's nominee. But hey, what do I know? I'm just some asshole with a podcast.
It was during this period, or a little bit earlier, actually, when Biden was vice president, I actually went to Hunter's house because he was a parent in the same school that we were parents in. His daughter was on the crew team with my daughter. They rode together.
This is why I'm doing this podcast. It's just incredible sometimes. Like, Jane Mayer has been covering and talking about Joe Biden and Hunter Biden for decades probably at this point. I don't know if she's ever disclosed that She knows Hunter Biden personally because their kids attended school together and rode together. They rode together. They were in the same boat, taking orders from the same coxswain. I did a little bit of digging, a little poking and prodding. Hunter Biden's oldest daughter, Naomi Biden, who was born in 1993, attended Sidwell Friends School, which is a Quaker school located in Bethesda, Maryland, and in Washington, D.C. I also learned that Jane Mayer has a daughter named Catherine Hamilton, who goes by Kate, who's likely around the same age. How do I know that? Because in 2015, she won the Truman Scholarship, which, according to the press release, she won as a junior in college, which would make her, 21 years old? So maybe born around 1993, 1994, around the time in question. So I'm not 100% sure. I haven't confirmed that this is the school where Jane Mayer's daughter and Hunter Biden's daughter attended together. But it seems pretty likely that we're talking about Sidwell Friends School. Reading from the Wikipedia page here, tuition for the 2022-2023 school year ranges from $47,200 for grades PK2 to $51,650 for quote-unquote upper school. So who knows? Maybe Hunter Biden's daughter and Jane Mayer's daughter got scholarships for rowing or something. My point being, there is a small club in Washington, D.C. Jane Mayer and Hunter Biden are both in it, and you and I most likely are not in that club. So yeah, it's just really gratifying when your suspicions are confirmed the way they have been now by Jane Mayer in this podcast. Like, I just always get the feeling when I'm listening to this podcast that I'm listening to people who are inside the bubble of Washington, who are close to power, and who, to be honest, seem to admire and sort of worship and do the biting of the powerful, the people who run this country. That's just the sense I get from listening to their political analysis week after week, and it's just so gratifying to have that be confirmed. And I'm glad you're all here to enjoy this moment with me. In my poking and prodding, I also found the wedding announcement for Jane Mayer with her husband, William Hamilton, September 27th, 1992, in the New York Times. Jane Meredith Mayer, a senior correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, and William Buford Hamilton, the deputy national editor of political coverage for the Washington Post, were married yesterday. The bride is the granddaughter of the late Alan Nevins, the historian who won 2 Pulitzer Prizes and was a founder of American Heritage magazine. She is the great-great-granddaughter of Emanuel Lehman, a founder of Lehman Brothers.
Another. Bumbleclot!
These people really are like onions. There's just so many layers to them. It's incredible. So from there, they do go on to mention a recent Washington Post article by a writer named Matt Visor. It is pretty interesting. I have to give him credit. The headline here, When Joe Biden Lost His Purpose. Basically, it details how Joe Biden did make the decision to run for president after basically discarding it in the wake of his vice presidency. So reading from Matt Visor's article here. He considered becoming an elder statesman, eyeing lofty foreign policy consultantships like those of former British Prime Minister Tony Blair or former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. His team was approached about a, quote, Biden law group that would tackle asbestos litigation, Medicare fraud, and government consulting. Hunter and Beau Biden were both interested and proposed a further conversation with their father. But the elder Biden seemed to have his sights elsewhere. Quote, he's not a guy who thinks of that world. Everything is macro, political, global. He wanted to write a book and do speeches, said one person who consulted with the family. He didn't want to do business. He's a big thinker, that Joe Biden. He's not just out to make a buck. There's some interesting tidbits in this article about the Biden family's disdain of Hillary Clinton that I think is pretty funny. Quote, many in the family, led by Hunter, had disdain for Clinton. F her, he wrote in February 2016 after a perceived slight of his father. He disliked her husband, Bill. Quote, what an asshole. God, he looks like shit, Hunter wrote in April 2016 after Clinton blamed Biden for the 1994 crime bill. And he derided consultant David Axelrod. Quote, what a complete and total asshole, he opined in October of 2015 when Axelrod criticized a, quote, draft Biden ad. Reading on here, the Biden circle was particularly aghast at Hillary Clinton's struggle to handle a controversy over her private email server, according to emails on a laptop that Hunter Biden apparently dropped off at a repair shop and never retrieved. This laptop somehow ended up in the hands of Rudy Giuliani, who said it was carrying a bunch of damning emails as well as really salacious photos of Hunter Biden naked and smoking crack. The great bastion of American journalism and free speech, the New York Post, famously reported on the contents of this laptop, and that story was silenced on social media by Facebook, by Twitter, and by a bunch of other media outlets because they said that it was Russian disinformation, and then that story later fell apart. But that came out well after the election was over, and well after one of the biggest newspapers in the country, the New York Post, had its account suspended in the lead up to the 2020 election. So remember that the next time someone in the mainstream media tells you about the prevalence of conspiracy theories and of disinformation and fake news. The mainstream media and the social media platforms censored a super relevant and interesting story that would have damaged Joe Biden in the lead up to the 2020 election, and who knows what would have happened if that story was allowed to be published and spread on social media. Continuing on here with Matt Visor's article, the Biden Brain Trust drew up papers for a Biden Foundation seeking $500,000 contributions from longtime friends and supporters. Man, I wish I had friends that were able to donate $500,000 to my foundation. In May of 2016, Bob Bauer, Biden's private lawyer, approved talking points that said, among other things, quote, the VP plans to dedicate the rest of his life to this new stage of his public service, end quote, and, quote, you can see from our proposed website that the VP is planning for a very energetic post-VP life. At the center of that new life would be the foundation, which would, quote, continue his life's work in foreign policy, cancer research, equal treatment before the law, preventing violence against women and children, supporting of community colleges, and American veterans. Skipping down a bit here, Biden also signed a deal shortly after leaving office that paid him a reported $8 million for 3 books to be written by him and his wife, Jill. All told, in the 2 years after he left the vice presidency, he and his wife reported earnings of $15.6 million, according to tax returns he later made public. That is a good amount of money for a man to ride off into the sunset on. But instead, Joe Biden announced that he would be running for president in 2020, and that decision was mulled over by the Biden family. Here we are towards the end of this article. At one point, Naomi Biden, Hunter's daughter and Biden's oldest granddaughter, called a family meeting. Remember her? Joe Biden's grandchildren told him that they knew a presidential campaign would provoke scrutiny and stress, but they were ready for it. Biden formally announced his third campaign for the presidency at a rally in Philadelphia, declaring that he was running, quote, to restore the soul of the nation. His grandchildren, along with his daughter Ashley, joined him on stage. The seat for Hunter was empty. Joe Biden, despite earning almost $16 million in the 2 years after he was vice president, and despite the death of his son, or perhaps because of the death of his son, and despite the addiction problems and family drama that swirled around Hunter Biden's addiction problems, Joe Biden still decided that it was imperative that he run for president. So from there, the hosts of the political scene go on to underline the difference in the way Donald Trump dealt with his legal problems and his recent felony convictions versus the way Joe Biden reacted to the conviction of his son on these gun charges. Donald Trump continues to insist that he's guilty of no wrongdoing in the matter involving the hush money payments he made to porn star Stormy Daniels. And he's also saying on the campaign trail that if he's reelected, he'll basically use the Justice Department against his political enemies. Joe Biden, on the other hand, accepts the fact that his son was convicted on these charges, and he said he wouldn't grant his own son a pardon or commute his sentence. So that is the disparity that's underlined by the hosts of The New Yorker. And then Evan Osnos has this kicker about the way that conservatives, and especially conservatives with money, are thinking about Donald Trump.
I remember talking to a serious financial big wheel who said, how do you not go from that to eventually impugning the sanctity of contracts? And now you see one billionaire after another lining up to support Trump. And somehow they've managed to find their way to imagining that this would not be bad for the very foundation of the market economy.
Another one.
Market economy.
Another one.
Market economy.
Another one.
Market economy.
Another one.
Market economy.
I really love it when these people show you who they are, when they show you what they're thinking about, where their priorities lie, what they find outrageous or troubling or interesting. And here's another classic example. Evan Osnos has spoken to some super wealthy Republican donor, and this wealthy donor is telling Evan Osnos he doesn't understand how Donald Trump's lack of respect for the criminal justice system and for the justice system in general isn't going to spread to the universal adherence to contracts. I just think it's beautiful that at the end of the day, when liberals say that they're concerned about the end of democracy, and a lot of people are thinking about what that might look like, Evan Osnos is having conversations with billionaires who are worried that Donald Trump has an eroding effect on rule of law as it pertains to contracts and private property. Thanks again for joining me. That is another one in the books for the New Yorker political scene. Stay tuned. I'm going to try to do this every week after the New Yorker political scene Washington Roundtable comes out. And I tried some new stuff with sound effects on this episode. Let me know if you think they worked, they didn't work, they're annoying, you love them, you're a DJ and you have some samples you might want to send me. Send them my way. I'd love that. Hopefully the podcast keeps improving and keeps spreading. And if that happens, I plan to continue doing it. So let me know what you think, and please tell your friends.
I want to some boy and them little jump on sound.